Someone had been stealing Harold Solomon's ideas. Of this he was certain, if not much else. Could it have been more than one person? That was entirely possible. Or were they agents working for a third party? Also possible. And exactly which ideas were being pilfered, and by what means? These last questions were where things turned more confounding. Harold's first inkling of the offense had come in February. He was riding the train to New Haven, where he was to give a reading that evening. The train was full, and he found himself regrettably stuck in a rear-facing seat. This position soon began to bother him. Beyond simply feeling wrong, it prompted a jagged anxiety he couldn't shake. The train rolled on, and his various attempts to ameliorate the unpleasant sensation went nowhere. Suddenly, the thought struck him that this is just like how we pass through life, condemned to a track bound for death, but with our backs turned toward it and our gaze directed ever more toward the past than the future. He liked this metaphor, but couldn't say he felt it was particularly accurate. Still, it seemed to diffuse his episode of dread, and that was good enough for the time being. 1 month later, reading a poem in The New Yorker, he encountered these concluding lines. "We are all condemned to the rear-facing seat of a train always in motion. Backs turned to the black hole at the end of the line, our gazes ever more comfortable looking back, not forward, to the small maudlin comforts of the past." It took a moment for the correlation to fully register. He read the lines again. There could be no doubt. There was his idea to a T, except transposed into verse. He was sure he'd never mentioned it to a soul. He didn't know the poet, nor, as far as he could tell, anyone else who did. Could she have been at the reception that night, he wondered? Could he have blabbed out this thought after more than a few drinks and since forgotten? He would have bet his life he hadn't. It could only be sheer wild coincidence. Although this seemed beyond all plausible bounds, he fully realized that was how coincidence worked. So he accepted this convenient explanation, as yet harboring no suspicion of anything more sinister at work. The second incident occurred the following week. Coming out of the movie theater after seeing a critically lauded European film he'd strongly disliked, he mused, "It has the appropriately sanctioned veneer of originality." Harold's friend, meanwhile, was enthusing over the film's genius, and just as he was about to counter with this very line, Harold decided to let it go. Because he knew to clash too harshly with his friend would only lead to a long and heated argument, and he simply didn't have the energy for it. So instead he said, "I didn't love it," and left it at that. On his way home, he repeated the thought to himself, and happy with the turn of phrase, he jotted it down in one of his notebooks. Later, he poured himself a whiskey and opened up his laptop. He couldn't help but remain annoyed by the film and the easy consensus over it. He blamed social media, his knee-jerk response to most critical and intellectual failings he encountered these days. And despite his self-admonition to rise above, he found himself scrolling through various takes on the film. One in particular from user Axe to Grind 101, an anonymous account with 3 followers, leaped out at him. He read with disbelief, "It has the appropriately sanctioned veneer of originality." His phrase, verbatim. For a long, frozen moment, Harold stared at the screen as if it was a hypnotic vortex that might pull him in. Then, still gobsmacked, he absently reached for his whiskey, only to knock it over. The ensuing crash yanked him back to awareness. Ignoring the broken glass, he double-checked to be sure he wasn't hallucinating. Then he did the only sane thing he could and poured himself another drink. A quick web search yielded no previous examples of this turn of phrase. This is some Twilight Zone shit, he thought to himself. And again, coincidence seemed the only possible answer. Well, other than someone breaking into his apartment in the half hour he'd stepped out and copying the line from his notebook before posting it online. No, such plagiarism was too much to swallow. More likely, he felt, the line had been written long before, somewhere, by someone in a text not yet digitized, but that he'd read once and forgotten about. His brain had then regurgitated it from the depths of his subconscious memory, setting him up to unwittingly claim it as his own. Why not? These things happened all the time. It also might be possible that although he'd never read it, the description did indeed predate his conceiving it, and by sheer chance he'd precisely duplicated it. If so, could he legitimately claim it as an original thought? He wanted to say yes. Plus, either option could equally have applied to Axe to Grind 101. Whatever the case, this time he resolved to investigate further. He couldn't scour every book and article ever written to track down this one sentence, but there were, he knew, various academic databases he might try searching. For the next week, this became his increasingly obsessive mission. As he feared, though, it turned out to be an exercise in futility. Harold now turned more paranoid. He ransacked his apartment and his all-but-forgotten storage locker for any sign, no matter how small, of trespass or tampering. Despite his suspicious mind's tendency to project wild significance onto every perceived discrepancy, he eventually had to abandon this deductive approach, too. The following Monday, he met his ex-wife Toni for coffee to give her some of her old papers he discovered during this frenzy of inspection. Harold was surprised to find they got along far more amicably than they had in at least a decade. It wasn't love reborn, but it greatly eased an underlying sense of guilt and self-recrimination he'd always felt about their breakup. At one point, he charmed her, or so he felt, with an account of his stolen idea from the train. She'd laughed and accepted the matter without concern. Original thought, she'd said, if it even exists, is overrated. Timing is everything. Timing, he'd replied grandiloquently, is the universe blinking one of its infinite eyes. You should write that down, she told him, and then insisted on paying the bill. 2 days later, he received an email from her with a link to a podcast she liked, and the note, "I think you forgot an attribution the other day, smiley face." He knew instantly what this meant. He almost didn't open the link, but of course he couldn't resist. Same line, exactly. His head spun. Could he have it all wrong? Was he somehow stealing other people's ideas without realizing it? That seemed absurd. Harold checked the date on the piece. It had only gone up yesterday. Toni hadn't bothered to look. Despite their recent thawing, this really pissed him off. He immediately emailed the host of the podcast about the line. He said how much he admired it and inquired if it was an old or new description. The host replied surprisingly quickly. "Funny you should ask," he wrote. "It wasn't even scripted. I came up with it yesterday and snuck it in. Glad you liked it." Yesterday, the day after his lunch with Toni. Obliterated, Harold spent the rest of the day listlessly wandering about in a semi-daze, trying to come to some sort of grips with what was now undeniably a pattern. The fourth case came that very night, and was the one that really sent Harold over the precipice into full-blown panic. After a torturous and intermittent sleep, he awoke from a particularly vivid and arousing early morning dream. In it, a scantily clad woman wearing an Abe Lincoln-style stovepipe hat was insistently gesturing him into a waiting car. Inside, Tony was talking loudly and obliviously on the phone. In the distance, a church bell struck the hour. Which hour, he couldn't say. Later that same day, reading the new book, The Silk Razor, by the celebrated anonymous French author known only as ZXY, he came upon the following passage. Lithe and tall, a gauzy wrap barely concealing her tempting nakedness, the mysterious woman in the stovepipe hat beckoned it into the idling car. Inside, its former mistress ignored it as she spoke on the phone. A distant church bell tolled. Harold half swooned as something snapped inside him. He worried he might be having a heart attack and grabbed the railing for support. They've invaded my dreams, he despaired. There could be no question now. His understanding of the world would never be the same again. It was like that first time you fully acknowledge your own mortality, or the psychological impact he imagined first contact with an alien species might cause. Everything could now be called into question. His rational mind quickly rejected any such preposterous scenario. There had to be another explanation than the supernatural or the supernatural or whatever term applied. Harold spent the next 24 hours in bed under the blankets. They proved to be an insufficient refuge. He'd already noted the progressively shortening time between incidents. This process continued to accelerate. He stopped keeping track of every theft he discovered. Soon, if he even looked out the window or walked down the street, he would encounter reflections of his own pillaged mind. He had only to conceive of something, and it was all but certain he'd encounter it elsewhere in the physical world. The prospect of seeing a psychiatrist was beyond laughable at this point. They'd lock him up for sure. Only action made sense. He became wholly consumed with the hunt for the source of his persecution. And for a while, a temporary sort of clarity accompanied this total fixation. Weeks passed, and he retreated from all work and society as he tried to retrace every possible missed connection or previous exposure to similar thoughts or imagery. Tangible evidence was nowhere to be found, however, and he increasingly turned to more arcane approaches. Coincidence, he was convinced, played no role. That he might, in the grip of some psychosis, be reiterating or reformulating information he'd already somehow ingested, consciously or not, was an appealing theory, but one that soon fell apart as his condition evolved. That he'd simply gone insane seemed far more likely. His sister, growing worried by his unresponsiveness, stopped by to check on him, but he refused to even let her into his apartment. Willing to try anything, he began to meditate several hours a day. At first, the meditation succeeded in blocking out most conscious thought, but it was to be only the briefest of reprieves. For soon, Harold found himself encountering external manifestations of his particular internal existence. His emotions, his, for lack of a better term, mindset or mindscape perhaps, seemed almost to be projected out into the world around him. It was a hopelessly vague phenomenon he couldn't adequately describe, but sensed all too acutely. It was as if his very individuality was being sucked out. Was he seeping out into the world, or was it somehow seeping into him through another dimension? Time entered a dreamlike fluidity. He no longer left his apartment. No hypothetical became too far-fetched to consider. God was unfathomably intervening in his affairs, or the devil, perhaps, or some other unrecognized deity engaged in a cosmic prank. Often he favored the now fashionable model that he was a construct inside a vast but failing computer simulation, or the subject of some insidious hallucinatory experiment, or on the receiving end of some inexplicable act of revenge. Simple madness remained the most compelling conclusion. And yet, he thought, I don't feel crazy, not in the least. Nor could he shake himself from this conviction, despite being fully aware that it had little bearing upon the truth of a person's sanity. What terrified Harold most was the prospect that there wasn't a single original thing about him, nor had there ever been, that he was merely a living pastiche of pre-existing ideas and feelings and memories. He curled himself into a ball and stayed that way for hours. Madness might not be the cause of his problems, but he knew they were pushing him rapidly toward it. Time compressed into the merciless now of the torture chamber. One day he sensed that he'd come to the end. Snap. Just like that. It would be a miracle if he lasted much longer in his present state of immobilized agony. Certainly he would kill himself rather than endure much more. This at first offhand determination brought him a profound calm. Any way out would do now. As painless as possible, of course. However, he wasn't quite sure he had enough pills to properly do the job. He took a last walk in the park and left a voicemail for Tony, who, of course, didn't pick up. Coming to his favorite bridge, he was wondering if it was high enough to ensure certain death or not when the breakthrough came. There was no warning. The idea was simply there, piercing in its clarity, almost as if someone had placed it in his head. Another option. Could it really be? He paused to reconsider every angle. Yes, it could. It was fucking brilliant, all right. A dizzying mix of elation and relief overwhelmed him. Harold's idea was beautifully simple. I'll expose this farce for what it is, he decided. I'll write down every last detail and publish it. Let's see them trying to steal that. He didn't know whether to dance or scream, and ended up doing both at once. Nobody else, he truly believed, could possibly have come up with exactly that same absurd tale, and he dared them to prove otherwise. Harold continued to dance, lost in this last gasp of hope at the doorstep of his final reckoning.